a nirvana for coders where you can just use code and not worry about copyright. In that nirvana, you can start and you build everything and everybody can just take it and use it. There's no issue. There's no fighting about it. There's no worrying about whether it's open or proprietary. You should not and you must not regulate coding. So what you regulate is the use cases and how the users use it. And they were talking about, do we regulate how you certify open source coders? I mean, you can't do that. Well, to me, it's a freedom of speech, right? It's an expression, it's a language. And I think what we've seen over the last 18 months, 2 years, is governments start to focus primarily on security, which I don't think is the right way to do it. I think actually they should be broader. I mean, I'm pleased that they're focusing on security because it's important, but I think the focus should be broader and it should be on this curation concept.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Hacking Open Source Business Podcast. And I am your host, Matt Yakovit, with co-host Avi Press. Avi?
Hello. Good to be here again. Matt, you're looking really high definition right now. It's like I'm in the room with you.
It's my new setup. I went and got a new camera on Black Friday, and I'm like, if I'm going to do more videos, I should actually look good. Or maybe it makes me look worse if people don't want to look at me. I don't know. But
you look great.
Thank you.
But not as good as our guest for today, who we will now introduce. Matt, go ahead.
Look at that segue. How's that for a segue? And of course we are joined by Amanda Brock, the CEO of the Open UK. Amanda, how are you doing?
I'm doing really well, thank you. You were also joined by Kat, but clearly he's not into the commercialization of open source software.
It's unpopular.
The cat will come back.
He might have heard it before.
The cat will come back. I just have a thing, like cats seek me out.
So it was you he was interested in.
Yes, it must be me. I have a voice that sounds like
maybe it's the high definition. The attracting cats. How many cats has it attracted before?
Thousands. Like they're just lined up outside the house if you saw them. It's like herding cats. That's what open source is, right? Herding cats.
Yeah,
I've heard that.
Yeah, well, you try being in the legal side of it.
Yes, right.
Source is herding cats.
So Amanda.
So maybe.
Go ahead.
Go ahead. Before we dive in, I think for those who don't know, can you give us just a really quick intro to Open UK? I think a lot of listeners are probably familiar, but maybe for those who aren't.
Sure. So Open UK is the industry organisation for the business of open technology here in the UK. It's a geographic organisation, and you'll probably have noticed that I mentioned open technology, not open source software. So open source software, open hardware, and open data, the three opens form our definition of open technology. And we're very much about the business of open source, open technology. So what that means is that we focus on individuals who work in or who want to work in open technologies. Now that means that they can work, so long as they're in the UK, for an international company, a UK company. They may work in a tech company, a non-tech company, like a bank or an energy company, all sorts of different enterprises, or the public sector. And we're quite a wide-ranging organisation. We work on three pillars: community, we bring together the leadership community across the UK in this space; legal and policy, we use their voice to have influence on laws and policies; and learning. And we probably are known for the kids camp work that we did initially, and now we're doing some work for students on building a massive open online course in entrepreneurship and open source.
Very cool. And Amanda, you're not just part of the Open UK, you're also on the board of OSI.
I am.
Yes. And how did that come about? I know you have a long background in open source, but why OSI?
So why OSI? Because OSI is the holder of the definition. It's the guardian of the open source definition and the approver of open source licenses. So for something to be open source software, it should have an open source license. And what that means is that it should have an OSI approved license. And I guess, I don't know if you want to talk about this or not, but I've worked in open source for 15 years. I have recently published a book. My background is that I was a lawyer. I was making lawyer jokes at the beginning. I joined Canonical at the beginning of 2008, and I was the first lawyer there and set up the legal team, ran it for 5 years. And I've worked with a number of open source companies since, and on a number of different projects before coming over to Open UK and freeing my shackles of legal restraint.
Well, okay. But there was a lot to unpack there because you have had such a diverse experience in the open source space. And, you know, we'll touch briefly on a couple of things that you mentioned. Number one, you did write a book, or, well, you edited the book and wrote a chapter, right? And so a lot of different stuff. I always get it wrong, the open source law, policy, and practice book. And
That's right.
I should know this because I'm doing podcasts with you for all the authors.
There we go. Here's one I prepared earlier.
See?
As we like to say here in the UK.
Yes. And it's a really, interesting book. I did get to flip through it, but Amanda wouldn't give me a book, Avi. So I don't know. Maybe we can work out.
Matt wouldn't.
I got one of the vouchers at LF Member Summit.
Oh, good.
So,
Good. Well done.
I'm very excited to read it.
That's not cool. I didn't get one, and I'm doing podcasts. I'm so distraught over that.
Well, you can download it because it's open access, non-commercial, Matt. So it's available thanks to the Veach Foundation, who paid for the open access for anyone to just download it and take for free. So you could do that.
I could, but there's just something about a paper copy. So, anyways,
would you read it?
Would I read it every day? It would be like.
Okay,
my
if that's the case, I will send you one.
My nighttime reading, like it would be right on the. I'll take a picture of it next to the bed, and so every night before I go to bed, I'll read a few pages of it to just get my mindset right, so I could sleep.
That could be your resolution for 2023. You could read a couple of pages every day because it's 640 pages long. 640 pages that I have read several times. Edit it.
Yes.
Not that I am bitter in any way about the amount of work involved.
So I think for a lot of startup founders in the open source space that are not, that have very little free time and are probably not going to be able to read all 640 pages, you said?
Yeah, that's incredible.
What are some of the main main highlights from an entrepreneurship perspective that maybe people on the business side might want to take away from your book, maybe a reason to go dive in?
So I think there are different chapters that read in different ways, right? So there's the heavyweight legal stuff on copyright and patents. And what we did was make sure that the index was as well referenced as it could be. So there are lots of words that the publisher hadn't considered to put in the index that we added in to make sure that you can find what you want from the index. So there's that piece. If you want to go and look up something, you should be able to search it reasonably. And then the next piece is that there are some very easy to read chapters by non-lawyers. So there's a chapter on the economics of open source by Mirko Bohm that's really interesting. I think it's really helpful. There's a really good chapter on setting up an open source program office, which contextualizes all of that by Nithya Ruff. There's a chapter on standards in open source that I think is actually the most controversial chapter in the book, but also it explains a lot about how and why open source works. And then I wrote the chapter on commercialization and revenue generation, which is pretty long. But again, we've tried to divide it up so you can find the bits that you want around that. So there's, sections in that talking about what the business models are that work well with open source. And then there's a chunk of it that explains what's happened in the last few years, which sometimes has caused some confusion and a bit of FUD.
So we all want the easy button when it comes to answers. And, so can you give us what everyone should be using, what business model they should be using if they're trying to use open source nowadays?
That's the absolute holy grail, isn't it? How to give all your assets away and still make money.
Indeed.
Over many years, a number of people have sort of researched this and done clever academic papers and research. Since about 2008, I think the first one came out. And they pretty much stick with 8 different business models, which are all set out in that book chapter, which are what you would expect. And, open source itself is obviously not, I say obviously, but open source is not a business model. It's a lot of different things to different people, but it's never a business model. In the same way as actually proprietary software is not a business model. Royalty fees and licensing is the business model. Selling support services or maintenance services, that's the business model. And there's often a confusion there amongst people. So for open source, there's a bunch of ways you can make money around it, but they all come back to a few categories. And there are things like subscriptions, support, the open core, the freemium premium type model, whatever you want to call that model where you have open source software with additional proprietary software that has a royalty model, that has been probably the most obvious model from the start, and it's been consistently one of the strongest, although there's a lot of different opinions around that, as we know. You then get things like embedded hardware, embedded software. You start to work through the different variations of that. And increasingly, I think we see SaaS business models where open source is used but not distributed.
Is that really still open source
Why would it
as
not
a service model?
License? Yeah, totally. Why is it not open source?
Well, if you said, but it's not distributed, right? So if you
But
create open source but don't actually give people access to everything, I mean, that's been kind of a controversial thing, right? Where you have cloud providers.
License, right? It still has a license. Other people can take it and go and use it. You just don't distribute it as part of the service. So you're still creating software that is out there in the wild that other people, because it's got the open source license, can take and reuse and recycle and go and build their own platform.
But
it's open source.
It's a good question, though. I mean, in terms of the fact that just because a piece of software is licensed to be freely distributed doesn't mean that it's actually made easily available. And I guess the way that we talk about open source doesn't really address that part of it, I guess, which is kind of interesting, I suppose.
Yeah, and there are requirements in some of the licenses about making the source available. I mean, that there is a requirement to do that depending on what kind of licensing you've used.
Making it available how? Like, what does that mean?
Well,
like,
I'm not going to get into all the detail of all the different bits that we go through.
Right.
But there are huge debates and discussions about what does that mean and how it's done and what you have to do, and that it has to be offered. The offer for the code has to be there along with the software. Mm-hmm. And you could get into the really nerdy lawyering debates. My view has always been that if you make it available via a site, whether it's a repo or a website, you're doing what you need to do. Not everybody agrees with that, but you do have to make it under certain licenses. For something to be open source, fundamentally what you've got is software where the human readable source code is made available on an open source license. And, it's a fluke of history that copyright was applied to code. And because of that, you have to have a license. Now, if you're just going to use it yourself and not distribute it to anybody else or make it available to anybody else, you don't need to license it because you're the creator. You only put a license on it to allow other people to use it. That's why we have licenses. And if we didn't have copyright, we wouldn't need them.
Yeah, and I think my point, getting back to the cloud or the as a service space, a lot of folks will start with what looks a lot like an open source project, but then they'll hide a lot of features or code that is never released. So in some cases might be critical in order to operate it fully, because I mean, it's like, it's an open core type of a strategy where it's like, here, have this piece, here, have this chunk. But at the same time, this chunk on its own might not give you everything you need.
But again, what we're talking about is how the software is licensed, not what the business model is, right? So you've got two bits to unpack there. You've got this is a SaaS business that uses some open source. And I think one of the mistakes we make is we talk about open source businesses. And I try to correct that, but it's hard to be that disciplined because we're all lazy. And what we really should talk about is businesses that use open source. Their business model is a support model. They're a support business. They're a SaaS business. And because we have this sort of pride, I suppose, in open source, and because it's been something that is controversial, that bucks the system, 10, 15 years ago, we looked at open source really differently from what we do now. So, I mean, people are often still bored by me talking about open source when I go to parties and things, and a lot of people can't explain what it is, but try 10, 15 years ago, I just didn't really, I work in technology. You mention one line occasionally to somebody and the eyes glaze over, too much detail. So I think that things have shifted a lot because the engineers have got stronger positions in organizations because of digitalization, because we've got more distribution, because we've got more open source. You've got some consumer products that have been successful. So, mainstream people understand it a little bit better.
Yeah. And, so I know, like, from an open source perspective, you talked about, the companies that are using it and, now it's not the business model necessarily, but there is so many companies and so many industries, so many different sectors of society that rely on open source. It's not just about the business side. And I know one of the things that you've been really passionate about over the last 6 months is, quote unquote, securing the critical infrastructure.
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about the work there and why that's so important.
Yeah, I think it is really important. So I've mentioned that there's been a big shift. So back, 15 years ago when I was at Canonical, it was really hard work because we were trying to get open source into businesses, into organizations, into the public sector. And, we were campaigning and I would use the term industry, but it wasn't an industry. The open communities were encouraging people to use open source software. And now everybody's using it. And it's happened at a rate of knots, and the level of and the scale of adoption is incredible. But it's happened over a 10-year period, and it's often happened without a lot of planning or a lot of understanding. And I've already alluded to the fact that a lot of that's come from digitalization, more engineers and lots of companies that didn't have them before. And there's a lot of either misunderstanding or complete lack of understanding of what you're taking on. So when you take proprietary code into an organization, you'll sign up to a license. It won't be a standardized license. It'll be a proprietary one. It'll be negotiated. It'll go through legal. It'll go through procurement. There'll be a finance decision about it. You manage your risk at that point. When you've got open source, it will largely come in on a standard license. In an ideal world, your organization will have a policy decision made about it and a policy about what licenses it accepts and how that works. But there will also be a risk involved. And that risk is about how you implement and what you do, what the technical practices, the good technical hygiene is, what the governance is and how you implement it. And one thing that the open source licenses have in common is they disclaim liability. So they say the developer is not liable. You use this at your own risk. Now, you could argue that most proprietary software isn't that different because of all the disclaimers and the exclusions of proprietary licensing. But let's focus on the standards. Let's focus on open source. And we know that when people take it on, they take it at their own risk. So they're responsible for where they use it. And they often haven't thought that through because it comes into their organization, it gets used, they become dependent on it, and it's only at the stage that they want to go and buy services that they actually start to assess it. But often they've tried to fit it like a square peg in a round hole. So that they've done what they've always done with proprietary without understanding that they have to do a bit more. You, the user, has to understand what it is that you're taking on. So we have this situation where there's massive adoption across the enterprise, and enterprise infrastructure is now built on open source, and the same's happened in our public sector. And we see not just our national infrastructure, but our national critical infrastructure sitting on top of open source code, but code that hasn't always been implemented well. And I think what we've seen over the last 18 months, 2 years, is governments start to focus primarily on security, which I don't think is the right way to do it. I think actually they should be broader. I mean, I'm pleased that they're focusing on security because it's important, but I think the focus should be broader and it should be on this curation concept, all the things that you have to do open source well in your organization, to bring it in, to manage it, to manage its future. But there also has to be a level of contribution back. Over the years, we've heard a lot about paying maintainers. And I think if you just think about the balance between individuals creating stuff that was, they free released it for everybody to use, but then they have users who now are going to put pressure on them because they need to be sure that it's maintained well because it's going to be used in, I don't know, a nuclear arsenal or whatever it is. That's a little bit extreme, but it could be.
But it happens, yeah.
Right, exactly. Or it could be, Boeing were really interesting. So Avi and I were at Linux Members Summit, and Boeing did one of the keynotes, and they talked about how that, they're not just a security focused organization. Safety is massive, and they've had issues that we all know about in the past, yet they've just allowed their engineers to start contributing back to open source because they know they have to do that. You go on your maturation journey, you start as a user, you become a contributor, and you become a distributor. So that contribution helps them to shape the software in the future, to ask for features to be included and that kind of thing. But you've got that big picture where people are using the scale of open source that they are, but particular things. So we saw Log4j last year, and I think it was 8 million platforms, 8 million users were impacted by the Log4j, Shell4j vulnerability. Now that's
It was a lot more than that too. Yeah.
well, that's what we've been told. And
Right.
the last thing I'm going to say on it is the interesting bit to me is that the security guys who I've been hanging out a lot more with over the last year, they're saying that it's the people who don't know they've got it because they think they've got a proprietary product, but actually they've got open source hidden away in it. So we talk about security, we talk about the good work that's been done in the US that the EU are now replicating. And you see there a focus on supply chain and software bill of materials. But that needs to be done in proprietary as well. I mean, that's about all software. Security is a software issue, not an open source issue. And for open source, our picture is slightly different. And I think it's about risk and managing risk by understanding what you're using and how you're using it and how to do it well. Was that too long? Sorry, I've got off on one.
No, not at all.
No,
not
it's
at all.
super
Falling
interesting.
asleep.
Well, I'm not asleep, but
No, the cat is though.
the cat is no. But it is interesting because you mentioned the focus, especially on the government side, the public side, on security, and those vulnerable areas. I think that things like Log4j and other hacking episodes become so newsworthy that it requires people to sit up and take notice. You know, and I think that a lot of bad actors and a lot of folks are out there looking at ways to exploit the good work that the open source community is doing. In fact, I was just reading today, there's a study that 144,000 phishing packages were found in a study where they looked at like all these different repositories where people push code, and that code is really all about trying to steal information and, hack into whatever systems you have.
Yeah.
And those are...
this,
Oh, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, it's so interesting, right? Because what's happened is we're not now just looking at a bunch of people creating software because that's what they're interested in, and all the folks like me that work around it or contribute in their spare time and, to the documentation, the governance, all that sort of stuff. We're not just looking at that. We're looking at society and politics and geopolitics. So you have things like the war in Ukraine and protestware. And, that brings the issue of open source to the top. You have, world leaders, governments worrying about bad actors because they're now worried about their infrastructure being hacked. They never used to worry about that when their highways, and their bridges and their hospitals weren't dependent on software, when they weren't digitalized.
Yeah.
And I think part of this conversation that is not really talked about nearly enough as well is just how much leverage the popular registries have over all of this stuff. Because, there's it's one thing to be, pushing malicious code somewhere via that registry, but ultimately, they are the ones that have the keys to whether or not that stuff is freely available to everyone. And it's a really hard job. And when you talk about, so many packages that are phishing related or just malware in general, how do you deal with typo squatting, for instance, and this kind of thing? And we have that on just a lot of volunteers are the ones making these decisions that really impact so many things. And so, I think it's a really, it's an underappreciated piece of this, that there's just a lot of real built up leverage and vulnerability in that part of the supply chain as well, which, And I think it
gets us to a point where we need to have, because we've somehow ended up, we know how we've ended up in the middle of these big international governmental policy infrastructure conversations. We need to create an environment where we start to discuss that across the board. So we have, proper international discussions that engage the open source communities with governments. So it has to be beyond a few companies talking to a government. It has to be all of us sitting at the table, understanding what's going on, and our representatives, impacting on those decisions. And we need to do something to make sure that the way that this is going to be divvied up, I don't know if that's understandable in American, but, split.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So the way it gets divvied up, it can't all end up going to the same projects or the same maintainers. It needs to be equitable in the way it's shared. And it's not just money. Money's important, and we need a lot of money, but we also need resources. And there's a need for that to filter through all the way to skills development and education. You know, we need the right coding being, or the right practices, the right computer science being taught in high school, being taught in universities, to apprentices, so that those people with the skills are there for the future. And I like to think that what's happening is a sort of readjustment. So, you know, when engineers started to code, you collaborated. It was mostly in universities and it was a collective project. And then as lawyers got it wrong and we put copyright on code, which changed everything. And if we hadn't done that, you wouldn't need, you know, if there hadn't been regulation and laws about copyright for code, you wouldn't have needed licensing. You could just all have collaborated.
What would the alternative have been, though? Like, how
Well,
would...
I think you would have created collective equity and you'd have created code that was for everybody and belonged to everybody, and that might have been really nice. And that's sort of where we get to, not quite, because we have this like legacy of copyright that we have to live with, and all the stuff that's happened over the last 30 or 40 years. But I like to think it's just a reset, a rebalancing. And if we think long and hard now and we do this well, that this will be the way we go forward. But if we don't think long and hard, people are going to look at open source and they're going to think it didn't work. And
Wait, I want to dig into this. This is very interesting. So, like, let's say I'm starting a completely fresh software project. I have no dependencies. I'm going to write my own operating system, my own, like, I'm just going to, you know, build it from the ground up. What would that look like? Like, how would I, you know, what would that even mean?
It's impossible, right? That's so much work. How are you ever going to do?
It's not impossible. I mean, not at all. Why?
Yeah, it's a lot of work. I'm sure people who, build operating systems are, okay.
It's probably a lot of work, Avi.
It's a lot of work, Avi.
Because,
because it is.
How much are you borrowing now from other projects, even if you don't realize it, because you've looked at the code, you've said like, this is interesting.
Well,
okay, I mean, just as a proof of concept, like, let's say I'm going to go build my own, you know, I'm going to go build my own computer. I'm going to have like a very simple, you know, 8-bit operating system, just as a proof of concept of what a non-copyright version of open source looks like, where I can still collaborate and there's no copyright. What does that mean?
Well, you see, that can't exist because you have this concept of public domain in the US, but we don't have it. So you can't not have copyright on code. So if you start from scratch and you say you're going to forget all the laws and you're in, you know, another, I don't know what the right word is, this, a nirvana for coders, where you can just use code and not worry about copyright. In that nirvana, you can start and you build everything and everybody can just take it and use it. There's no, you know, there's no issue. There's no fighting about it. There's no worrying about whether it's open or proprietary. There's no, you know, can I make money out of it? They're making money out of it over there, because everybody just uses it. It belongs to all of us.
Okay, but here's a weird thing, though, because we're advocating for more government oversight and control to secure these things.
I'm not arguing for that.
Well,
I'm definitely, let's be clear. I'm definitely not arguing for government oversight and control. I'm arguing for governments to start to engage and to work with us to work out. Be really careful. There's a huge difference. So, and I've been really specific talking to people like the Commission who were talking about this a few years ago. You should not and you must not regulate coding. So what you regulate is the use cases and how the users use it. And they were talking about, you know, do we regulate how you certify open source coders? I mean, you can't do that. Well, to me, it's a freedom of speech, right? It's an expression, it's a language. So, you know, absolutely not. But what you regulate is the use case, and that's already happening. So if you're in financial services, if you're in automotive, you know you've got regulations and you've got liabilities. What you need to do then is to understand it. What I think governments should do is I think they should set up public-private partnerships. I think they should work with enterprise. I think they should work with engineers and all of us who form this, you know, broad community around open source. And they should develop what I would call a steward, which would be an organization that is almost like a tide lift, that sanitizes the code that's used by the public sector, that sits between the communities, the contributors, whether they're business communities, individuals, whatever it is, that sits between them and government usage, so that the public sector manages itself and does it right. And it depends on how you define an OSPO. I don't think it's really an OSPO. I think it's a hybrid between an OSPO and a foundation.
I mean, it still puts someone in charge of that kind of like oversight and government oversight. It doesn't have to be government. It's just another body that could
oversight, but oversight for their usage, not oversight of open source. open source should not be regulated. Let's be really clear on that.
Yeah.
Software should not be
Yeah,
regulated.
I agree. I agree.
Yeah.
But
I don't want anybody listening to this to go off and think
yeah,
that's
well, they're all going to go off.
Right. I guess it's just that I would even be maybe a little bit dubious that any government is capable of being involved with something that it doesn't regulate.
Oh no, no. I think that's no. So there are a lot of them are very involved with stuff that they're not regulating, and that's the problem. So they need to sort of work out a way, and they need to manage it for themselves so that the end product is well managed, and the end product being the services they deliver to us as consumers, to their citizens. But also they need to give back. It's inequitable. Right, so they need to be giving back funding, and I don't want them to go off and do that country by country, because if they do, you might disagree with me, but I think if they do, it's just going to be an absolute mess, and you need to have them integrate somehow. We almost need a UN, and I know that the UN isn't the perfect example, but we need a UN of open source. We need a way for all the governments to be looking at digitalization together. Even AI ethics has got a similar problem. You need it to work cross-border, and you don't want pockets of differentiation that really throw everything out of kilter for everybody else, and you don't want the funding and the resources all being applied, as I've said already, in one place. You want them to be equitably distributed, and in the unsexy areas as well, right? Because they need it.
Yeah. And so, Amanda, so copyright bad is what you said. That's what I got. Like we need to abolish all copyright. And it was a mistake. It was a mistake.
I think it was, right. Personally, this is not, an Open UK opinion. I personally think it was a mistake.
Okay.
And I think it would have been so much better if they hadn't done that. And we'd created, one of the things I've talked a lot about is a digital public good, and that open source ought to be characterized not just in the commons, but as a digital public good. And that is a way of managing it. We're not going to escape the copyright. I mean, I've had this conversation for over a decade. You're not going to go and change the laws.
So
that's what we've got.
You mentioned something else there. And, I want to switch gears here because you also mentioned AI. And you had said that, when we had talked about your book, the biggest thing that you missed in the book was not kind of talking about AI and the implications.
Thanks, Matt.
Yeah. Well, you said it publicly. You're the one who said this publicly. I have a clip.
No, this is not a critique. This is we're gonna write the chapter.
We're gonna write the chapter right now.
Yeah.
Right now.
I'll be really honest about it. I have avoided AI. 5 years. This book took 5 years, and when we started thinking about it 5 years ago, it wasn't relevant to open source in the way it is today. Right, so we avoided it. Or we didn't think it through enough. And I think we should have done more in security as well, actually, in curation, but they were coming around towards the end of the book as being key topics. And 24 chapters is a lot. I have thought that we should maybe go and try and create an addendum with more security, a bit on curation and an AI, and we might do that, although I have said I'll never do it again. AI is a topic, personally, that I've tried to avoid because I think it's too difficult. And security for a long time... Right, it's too hard. And security for a long time was a topic that I avoided because I feel that you have to really know what you're talking about not to cause problems, and you have to be an expert, and I don't feel that I am on that.
Well, I'm a pot stirrer, so I'm going to try not to avoid it, especially considering there is a topic that merges what we're talking about with trademarks and copyright, right, and AI with Copilot. So
I knew you were going to go there.
I am curious, because you happen to be one of our favorite lawyers,
Yeah, I was going to say I'm not a lawyer anymore, but can you stop being one? I don't know.
I don't think you can.
Yeah, I'm not.
You're
just branded that the whole time. It's cool. So, curious your take on taking let's say open source code and using AI to write new code or take snippets.
I don't know yet. I'm working it through. I don't understand all the nuance well enough, in all honesty.
That's fair. It's really complicated. And
yeah.
I mean, do you think that, to kind of ask a related but still interesting question with this, do you think that the tools that are generating code, whether it's legal, moral, whatever, are fundamentally different than the tools, the stable diffusions or these kinds of things that are generating art or natural language or these other things?
Yeah.
Is there something different about generating code?
I'm not sure that there is. And even, if you think about a developer using tools as they're generating it day to day, is there a difference? How much human control do you have to have? Who makes that decision? And I think it also gets into this realm where I already mentioned that, you need it cross-border, but you need all of the AI stuff to be really joined up. And I don't know what the answers are. I honestly, it's something, Matt, and I'm not just avoiding this up. You know that I have an opinion on everything, right? I don't like this because I spent 5 years doing the book. I've not had a holiday this year because I've been editing this. I was about to say stupid book. It's not a stupid book. Cut that. It's excellent text, but it's been a lot, and it's meant that I haven't had the time that I would normally dedicate to really thinking about it.
Well, let me take a thought experiment outside of the AI realm. Okay. Mm-hmm. And I am legitimately curious about this. We all have access to immense amount of source code, right?
Yeah.
And so we all know that if you take a library, a package, and you include it, there are certain, things that you have to do that follow the license of whatever you're copying. Yeah. However, what about code snippets, parts of the code? Because, I mean, from a, outside the AI perspective, we all have probably seen something that we like, and whether consciously or subconsciously say like, oh, I love how they did that. Let me copy that.
Yeah.
Where does it become?
Where do you define all these things? So what's a snippet? How much? So I work on the basis that when I first got into open source, there was something written, and I won't say on whose site, but one of the foundations had something that was wrong legally on their site about how many lines of code you had to have before copyright applied. And it was just wrong. And I used to get into these arguments with developers. I generally worked on the basis, I learned everything that I knew about open source from the Ubuntu guys and the people I met around that. And the people from there had been in the Debian environment. And, they really taught me a lot. And I was super respectful of their legal understanding because they knew a lot more about the nuance of open source than I did. And it took me a long time to catch up. And some of them still know more about licensing than I ever will or want to. But you have a level where, you can take a very small amount without copyright applying to it. The problem is defining what that is not a rule. You can't create a rule the way the law works. So I work on the basis that you're best to default to absolutely everything having copyright in it.
Okay.
It's just it's safe. You can spend a lot of time arguing about it legally, which is the only people who will win are the lawyers. They'll get paid. So personally, I think you just work on defaults that make it easier. So just assume there's copyright.
That's so counterintuitive to me because I feel like there's, I feel like what that implies is just that you could theoretically have copyright over like mathematical functions or like things that. And
then what you have to remember is what is copyright. And again, I'm being a boring ex-lawyer here, but copyright is not about an idea. The idea would be expressed in a patent, and that's how you protect it. It's about the actual lines of code, so it's about the actual iteration. So you have to lift and shift. If you just see something and then you go and write your own version of it, that's fine. I mean, that might get into if you've got contractual obligations around, non-disclosure and confidentiality, or with your employment contract or something, you might get into problems. But if you've seen something and you go and create your own version of it, that's not a copyright breach. It's actually it has to be identical to be copyright.
Well, right, but if you pick like really basic things, you're like, I'm gonna copyright a function that checks if a number is even. There's like not many ways to do that, but like most people would be violating copyright when they implement that in their code at some point.
And then you get this whole line of
you get in these really weird places very quickly, and I feel like someone who. Yeah, just like how do you keep open source safe from like patent trolls, basically? Well,
you're just jumping around
without naming any names,
right? So you and you get copyright trolls, but you're sort of jumping slightly there because the idea of copyright is that you've created something that has a value in it, that it's not just that basic. So that's part of the problem, and it's part of the reason that I wonder whether copyright should ever have been applied. But we get back to my nirvana and reality. So I think that you have to work on the basis that anything has the copyright, and you just apply that across the board. Now, how that's going to work with my which will have to be after February, after our conference, but my exploration of AI, I don't know. If you speak to me in 6 months, I might have a different view.
Well, we'll have to do a round two, have you on the podcast again sometime. Then.
And just to clarify for those who are listening, when we're talking about copyright and we're talking about OSI licenses, okay? I just want to clarify. The OSI licenses aren't necessarily just copyright, right? So
no, that's true. No, absolutely. So some licenses, so we require a license to share, right? If something has copyright in it, anybody beyond the creator of it or whoever owns that copyright cannot use it without a right, and that right is what the license is. So you give them a shot of it, you let them borrow it by giving them a license, and they can use it so long as they comply with the terms of that license, and that's copyright. Whereas patents are about an idea, and some open source licenses also include patents. Not all, but some do. And then trademarks are expressly excluded from others. And those three are three kinds of intellectual property. You get into things in Europe like database rights, and in the US like trade dress as well. But those aren't really dealt with. But the copyright and the patents are dealt with, and trademarks are specifically excluded, which means if you're an open source project, one of the things that you ought to be advised to do is to register trademarks. And this is a fundamental problem for the OSI. So Bruce Perrins, who sadly has been ill recently, but who was over in the UK a few months ago, he and I spoke at an event, I would say together, but we both spoke at the same event. And then sitting in the pub afterwards, he was telling us about trademarks and why the OSI doesn't have a trademark. And he said that they were advised not to register one. And if that is right, that was a bad piece of advice. Because what a trademark is your brand of origin, your certification to prove something comes from where it is supposed to have. And Bruce was told, he says, not to have registered open source, which is why it's a problem. And by the time we went to register it, it was too late, because once something's in common parlance, you can't, it becomes descriptive, and you can't register a descriptive word as a trademark. So had that advice not been given, it'd be really clear and simple. We could be saying there's an absolute here that, you have to have an OSI license for it to be open source. But personally, I don't think an error in legal advice like that should stop us understanding what the fundamentals of open source are. So for me, an OSI approved license is what's required for open source software, and it will potentially include more than copyright, as you say, Matt.
So what is, you mentioned a lot already, but I'm curious, what do you see as the biggest challenge to the open source community right now? Like, what do you see out there, if you're going to look in your crystal ball for the next couple of years, that we need to get a handle on?
So I've done this weird thing this year where I've done a bit of work with the public sector, and it's not something I've really done before. And it's created understanding for me.
That you had to do work with the public sector.
Oh, sorry.
It was a joke. Oh my God.
That's how to make me quiet. So the thing that's strange is that I've always been frustrated by the fact that people use open source because they think it's a cost saving, right? That's you. Whatever survey you do, whatever reports you read, it's the number one reason, and it shouldn't be. It should be the quality of the code, the collaboration, the innovation, all those other things that they go for. And working with the public sector, what I realized is that they use open source for two reasons, and it's why governments want them to. One is to avoid lock-in, and the other reason is to create code that can be recycled and reused, both of which save money in the long term, and that's why they drive towards it. And one of the things that I've discovered is because people don't follow good curation and good practices, when governments give money for open source development or they ask for things to be open source, they go back to that pure legal definition that I've been talking about, that it's OSI approved license, and that it's shared on a public means. We were talking about how the code's made available, Abby. So, if you put it on a GitHub, a GitLab, whatever repo you're using, plus you put an OSI approved license on it, it's open source. And that is a legal definition, and it's what I would use in a contract, but actually it's not enough. You need to have contributions. or you end up with something that's not really open source or getting the value of open source. You need to have collaboration. You need to have people participating in your project. You need to be thinking about how that project is going to be maintained in the future. I mean, I asked one person in an interview how a project was going to be maintained because they had no contributors, and they told me they had a 3-year service contract. I mean, that's proprietary code. That's not open source. It's just unbelievable. And it's not the UK. I've been talking to people all over the world who've been, doing more in this space than I have for much longer. So I think that there's a challenge here. First of all, we had the challenge of getting them to use the OSI approved licenses in the first place. And then there's a challenge of the understanding of the bigger picture, that open source is all of these other things. It's about having documentation. It's about having good technical hygiene and good governance. And that's whether you're distributing it or whether you are bringing it into your organization and using it. And that sort of journey, that maturation, we talk about it in the State of Open report we did earlier this year. We've actually got a really nice model that goes through use, contribution, distribution, and looks at the different correlated behaviors like joining OIN, the Open Invention Network, that kind of thing, and at what stage that happens, and whether it's as you move through these steps or whether it's when you've done them for a certain length of time. So you've been a user for 10 years and that gets you to do it, but you've been a user for 1 year and a distributor for 1 year and you don't do any of these things because you haven't got maturity. So I think that's a huge challenge in the public sector, and I think we're going to see a lot more discussion about it. And then there's this whole piece we've already talked about the critical infrastructure. And part of the concern I have there is that a lot of people are coming into this from outside, getting involved and having opinions who don't necessarily understand the nuance of open source, some of that big picture I'm talking about. And I think there's a real danger that if we don't work together and really collaborate now and do this well, that will be a flash in the pan, will have been a disruption to proprietary.
So there's a lot to unpack there. I mean, I think one thing
you keep saying that
there is. You should take this as a compliment that you say things that have a lot of impact and make people think. So that's a good thing, right?
Information dense.
Yeah, okay. Too much information is another line.
Well, you mentioned contributors as a critical thing, and we see that all the time where most open source companies really kind of define themselves heavily around the number of contributors that they have, the community space that they can generate.
That's a good thing.
And that's a good thing. But I have noticed there are a plethora of projects that while they might have a large number of contributors, the amount of contributions from outside contributors is very, very small. And so it's a bit of
single vendor products.
Yeah, it's a bit of bait and switch a little bit, because I was looking at like the top 30 projects that had Docker images this week, and in the open source space. And as I was going through, it's like, oh, this one has one maintainer who does 99% of the code. This one has,
that's like a lot of open source is that. Like I would say probably most of it is that way.
So
no, I mean, I guess I would need the data to really.
I think you're right, Avi.
I'd love to see that data. And what you're talking about is the smaller pieces, Avi, I think, as opposed to what a company is producing, which is going to be an overall product with multiple pieces that make that product. And when you see that product having, saying it's open source and having contributions from nobody but its employees, now that could be because it's employed all of its community. And that's what we're thinking about. But also it gives the gives the company control. And I like the way Adam Jacob talks about loose and tight open core, which I go into a little bit of depth on in my book. You can look those up in the index, or you can just Google Adam's blog about it, which is heavily quoted from in that chapter. And I think he's got it right. And it's whether when you've got open core, your company is driving and your community is separate, or when you've got it, the community is the key and the company is like a welcome addition that sells services around the product. And I think that applies not just to open core, but across the board to organizational involvement and revenue generation in open source. Is it a product that's being driven by an open source community, which companies take advantage of and sell or not? And I think when you see companies like Percona who support their competitors' products, that kind of model is increasingly becoming the norm. And again, that's a healthy and a good thing because it creates that variety and sort of shifts away from that single vendor type set of issues.
Yeah, I think there are several open source or quote unquote open source vendors who are only using open source as a marketing tool. And so they don't really care about the community per se.
Well, you also reference bait and switch, and I don't know if everybody will know what that is, but it's when a company uses the opportunity to say something's open source to effectively make it open source to build ubiquity, and takes advantage of what's happened in the last decade where open source gets to market so quickly. And then when it gets to a critical point, effectively locks its customers in by shifting to a proprietary model.
Yeah. Bye-bye open source. Right? That's really what it is.
You say that, but then the key to open source, and I was talking to someone about this just the other day, is the ability to fork. And forking is the way that the community keeps a leadership in check in open source.
It's the elastic example with OpenSearch, right? So, you had an immediate fork in that space. And so that's great. Although it doesn't always happen that way. It just depends on how community driven it is. I think, for instance, Mongo, when they switched to SSPL, they didn't see that fork.
No, and also forking is the control point, is the tipping point, but it's also a lot of work, right? You've got to go and do the work. So it allows control and keeps leadership, we hope, in check, but everybody knows it's a lot of work.
Yeah, absolutely.
I guess there's also the consideration of just kind of like completeness of the project. Like there is some software that you really like, you get it to achieve the goals that you set out to achieve, and it doesn't really need a whole lot after that. There's just code that runs on our machines that just probably hasn't been touched a whole lot in the last 10 years, and it's just there. And a lot of those kinds of things often were just probably written by a couple people, and so maybe that's the one piece I would maybe have a slightly differing view on it, about kind of how the importance of, I mean, not that contributions are not important, because they certainly are. I just don't think that they're a requirement necessarily to be useful.
I think they are to get to a certain stage. And again, when you're talking about those pieces that have been there forever, they're probably not things that were done with an enterprise.
That's probably true.
Generally, I think that generally is the case. And also, we should always remember that a lot of the things we're talking about here, the same issues apply in proprietary. We just can't open the black box.
Right.
It's
Totally.
a software issue, right? And it's about, and sometimes it's like, that boiling the ocean phrase. We're trying to fix things that are open source, but actually we're trying to fix the whole of digitalization and tech and software. And that's a lot to take on.
Sure is.
This is easy. Let's fix it. Let's fix it all.
Yeah, what is it, Thursday evening? Let's do it tonight.
I can do it by Monday.
Just fix it.
We have till Monday.
Yeah.
All right. So, Amanda, I like to ask this question because we're in the holiday season.
Hence my Christmas jumper.
Oh, I didn't even notice that it was a Christmas jumper.
My Christmas jumper.
Hey, that's awesome.
Or my festive jumper.
I would have wore my ugly sweater, but I didn't. So I apologize. Maybe next time. But for all of the open source community and the geeks on the Christmas list, what is the thing that you would gift them? Like if what would be the gift?
Toiletries.
Toiletries. All right. Explain.
No, I just think it's like,
I don't think that needs an explanation.
it's a lovely. Everybody likes them.
Maybe
everyone likes them. Okay. So everyone.
That was not what I was
Amanda's
expecting.
going to get us all toiletries in the open source space. Is that for dealing with the crap, that comes with open source projects? I don't know. Like, is there like some subtle subtext in there?
Well, anything that they want is going to be too expensive, isn't it? Or they would have it.
Well, I'm not. I'm just saying, like,
You make it difficult. You asked a question. I gave you the
all right,
answer.
fair enough. Fair enough. So, you could have said your book. You could have said a lot of other things, but
No, that's what I have given them. So you asked a question that I could answer easily, or chocolate, perhaps.
Oh, you have?
No,
Okay.
chocolate or
I
toilet.
took that in a very different way.
Yes. Well, everyone's a little different. Some people have said monitors. Some people have said keyboards. Some people have said.
I'm not going to spend that on them.
Okay.
Yeah.
We're not worth it, Avi. But that's okay. So...
Or I'm underpaid.
Yeah, maybe. But, Peter said, like, the must-have gift, was going to catacombs and looking at skulls. So he was going to gift
Oh, I've
trips
done that.
for a Christmas
Quite
gift. That's
interesting,
what he was going to
actually.
do.
No, it's quite an interesting thing to do.
See, there you go. So now we've got
Nice.
skulls, keyboards, monitors, toiletries. It's awesome. It's awesome. So Amanda, I know you have a conference coming up, and State of Open 2023. I have submitted 3 proposals to it.
Have you?
I have.
Oh, wow.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So
So
you're determined to come then?
I'm determined to come.
Yeah, it looks like I'm going to be able to make it too, as well. I was going to
That's
email
great.
you that, but I'm just telling you that right now.
Whoa!
Okay, well,
We're
let's
announcing live news. Avi will be there.
Everybody's really well, Avi. I'll tell you what we can do for you. So the conference is going to pick up on some of these things that I've been griping about today, and we hope that we'll have some people from the public sector and governments internationally who will be able to talk a bit about how we can start to meet this challenge. It is obviously not going to provide a solution, but it's going to be a starting point for an open conversation, a broad conversation, to stop open source failing. But we then have a day and a half with 7 tracks. We have platform engineering, security, law, policy, government. We have open hardware, open data in the spirit of the 3 opens. And we have an unconference that is going to be so much fun. But also we have an entrepreneurship track. And that entrepreneurship is about the business of open technology, but business of open source. And we're planning to do something a little bit different where we'll have 20 hosted tables in the room. Everything will be streamed, so people will be able to watch it, and that's free to watch. But there'll be 5 sessions over the day and a half. One of them will be led by John O'Bacon on community. There'll be others around things like revenue generation, the things we're talking about today, but really focused on revenue generation, how you make money when you've given everything away, and other relevant topics like community contribution, scaling, all those things specific to open. And we will have 20 founders, I hope. I'm working on getting 20 founders to be sitting at a table each and hosting those tables. And the plan is to have a 45-minute workshop or panel session, followed by a 45-minute discussion at tables. And we're looking to have scribes take notes so that we can report on that and build a proper report out of it. But the content that's recorded from the workshop will also be used in our MOOC, our Massive Open Online course, and in the next year or so become available as a sort of proper educational tool. But Avi, would you like to be one of the founders? Come and be a founder and host a table.
Oh,
And,
would love that. Yeah, absolutely. Would love this.
There'll be all sorts of
Thank
different founders there, which means that it will give people access to those who've succeeded or are succeeding or are working on and hands-on on the coalface, building businesses around open technologies, open source software. And that kind of access you don't often get. You might want to try and find someone at a conference, but it's not easy. So we're looking at how we can book out those tables in advance so that people can choose the founders they want to sit with, avoid them being able to sit with the same founder 5 times. We don't want people being stalked at the same time. But I think it's a good opportunity for people, and it should create some really interesting conversations, I hope.
Yeah, I think for the founders listening to this, I think one thing that we've learned at Scarf a few times over now is just the unreasonable effectiveness of making in-person connections when it comes to promoting your project or your business or that kind of thing. There's really not a good substitute for it, and that was something that we even saw the data of that over in Scarf in terms of what was happening after we were making just getting out there and talking with people a lot more. And so for those of us starting businesses in the space, it's I think highly recommended.
Yeah. So the streaming is free. The conference is very, very heavily subsidized by sponsorship. And, we're not there to make money, although we have to survive as an organization. But what we've done is we've reduced the cost dramatically, and it's 199 sterling for the 2 days. So I hope that will make it accessible to almost anybody. If it doesn't and you can't afford that and you want to come, contact us and we'll see what we can do. There will be some free tickets as well. We're just working through all the Open UK volunteers at the moment to make sure that they get the opportunity before we make them publicly available. But I think the 199 price tag, when you compare most conferences, are £1,000 for 2 days. Yeah. So I hope that people will be able to come and join us for that. And we've got a space for a lot of people, and it will have one other element. And I know there's often sort of booths and stands and things at conferences. So we're going down the route of a Scale or an All Things Open or FOSDEM and having tables. and we'll hopefully have quite a lot of those where you can meet a lot of different people, picking up what Abby's just said. But we're calling those areas DX, Delegate Experience, and we've got a few really nice, interactive, exciting things to share that people won't normally get at conferences, including the fact that we're going to have some stuff going on in the outside space around the building as well. We've got 5 floors of the best conference centre in London, which is between Westminster Abbey and the House of Parliament. So, you can see Big Ben out the window, you can see Parliament out the windows. It's really quite a space. So I really hope that we'll get a lot of people who are coming over from FOSDEM who'll decide that they want to stay on here in the UK. And also, we've not had a big open source conference like that in the UK for a long time. Ross Gardler left, I think, in 2013, and he used to organise something in Cambridge. I think it was Cambridge, maybe it was Oxford, but it was quite a big conference. But we're looking to try and get 1,000 to 2,000 people through the door to have something really cool. Significant. Yeah.
Very cool.
Looking forward to it. Yeah, very excited.
Yeah. Please see you both coming.
Yeah.
If that gets accepted, I'm not got anything to do with that.
Oh, well, you could give me a table just to show my hat collection. I could bring the hat collection.
Can you make it interactive?
Can I make it interactive?
Oh, can he make it interactive?
Can I make it interactive?
Matt, we can have a hat table, but we haven't got into. I have a lot of hats too.
Ooh, we could do a hat swap.
You don't want to wear my hats. I have hats for going to Ascot. I mean, my hats are big and flowery, and yeah.
Maybe
you do wear my
hat. Matt loves big and flowery.
Why wouldn't I want? I'll wear any hat. I'm just a hat guy.
Okay, you heard it here first. You'll wear any hat.
Yeah. Bring me hats. Find me at FOSDEM. Find me at this conference.
We are going to make him regret saying that. That is for sure.
Avi, you've seen some of my hats.
I have. And
do you think I have any shame when it comes to my hat collection?
So you would like to apply for a table to put hats on, Matt?
Okay, I'll apply for Matt's hats.
Matt's hats. That's not original. You've not just thought of that now. You've been calling it that for a long time. Come on, tell me.
I will neither confirm nor deny Matt's hats exists.
Okay, so I'll go and write that down on the list of table holders.
Good to know.
All right, Amanda, thanks for hanging out with us today. We appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
Don't forget to check out Amanda's website, amandabrock.com. You can get open access to the law policy practice book that she has just edited. It's open access, so it's free to everybody. You can download it, or you can try and harass her to get a paper copy or buy your own, which is probably better.
There's actually a code for 30% off if you want to buy it on that website as well.
There you go. That's awesome.
Great.
And of course, we'd love it if you like and subscribe and do all those fun things for the Hacking Open Source Business Podcast.
It helps a lot more than you might think. So please just like, subscribe, comment, etc. It really helps. So
yeah, Amanda wouldn't come unless we had more than 200 subscribers. She's like, that's my minimum.
I was going to ask you if you got any subscribers.
Yes, we do. Did you go?
Look.
Yes. Anyways,
it was just a pleasure to talk to you both. Thank you very much.
Of course. Thank you very much, everyone. And until next time, we'll see you later. All right, we're good.